Plesioth is one of the first piscine wyverns in Monster Hunter, introduced in the very first game. Like most wyverns, he has 2 wings, legs, and a single tail, although Plesioth stands incredibly tall on his own. He likes to reside in jungles, forests, swamps, deserts, and sometimes mountains, particularly areas that have close proximity with water. Plesioth is also amphibious, capable of swimming around and walking on land. Plesioth usually starts in the water, where you're unable to reach him. From here, he can either fire a beam of water upwards at you, or sweep it around. Eventually he will jump out and shimmy across the ground. Plesioth's land attacks consist of a bite, a water beam aimed straight ahead, and shimmying across the ground. 2 of his most infamous attacks are his tail spin and hip check. These are attacks that many monsters have, but what made them so infamous with Plesioth is that the hitboxes were widely inflated. You see, because he's so tall, his tail is high above the ground, so logically when he spins around, it wouldn't really count as an attack, right? But if you're standing under him, you will still be hit, and it's the same for his hip check. In G rank, Plesioth will often sweep a beam across the ground while standing upright. Green Plesioth is a subspecies introduced in Monster Hunter G. He is generally identical to the standard form, but he does have the ability to put you to sleep while leaping from the water. Plesioth was not the only piscine wyvern in the first game, as it also featured Cephadrome, a sandy coloured fish who can always be found in the desert. Cephadrome is the adult form of the smaller monster Cephalos, and generally, he is encountered earlier in the game than Plesioth. While Plesioth swims in the water, Cephadrome swims in the sand, allowing him to move around you. He has the abilities of hip check and swing his tail, although with his smaller size, the attacks don't have the same hitbox discrepancy. Like Plesioth, he can also shimmy across the ground. Cephadrome can also spit sandblasts from his mouth and leap out of the sand. You can also force him out of there by throwing a sonic bomb. Lavasioth made his debut in Monster Hunter Frontier, but was later brought over to Freedom Unites. His name implies a volcano-based Plesioth, which is true since, like Plesioth, Lavasioth swims around in lava rather than water, before eventually fighting on land. However, he looks completely different, being grey, looking much more fish-like, with an increased body mass and reduced wings. While swimming, Lavasioth can splash magma chunks onto the ground. Rather than leap onto land, he prefers to dig underground and surface from there. Generally, his physical attacks are the same as Plesioth's, although he also has original attacks and other major differences. For example, Lavasioth appears to be much better at shimmying than Plesioth, being able to change directions when enraged. He can also leap up into the air and land, causing tremors. He can spit magma chunks that explode into smaller chunks and swing his tail from side to side. Plesioth and Cephadrome were introduced in the first generation of Monster Hunter, while Lavasioth was brought into the second generation after being introduced in Frontier. Moving on to the third generation, however, none of the piscine wyverns were brought back for Try. However, Plesioth and Green were later brought back to 3 Ultimate. These games were quite unique in that they let you fight monsters underwater, and the result of this is that you can now follow Plesioth down there. On land, Plesioth is the same as he always was, although it would appear his hitboxes have been cleaned up a bit. His tail appears to swing lower to the ground, making the swing attack better telegraphed. When underwater, Plesioth can leap up into the air and dive back underwater for a huge impact. He can rapidly swim across the arena, twist around and flick his tail forward, and even spin like he does on land. He can also fire his water beam and hip check. Plesioth will choose to move between the land and sea on his own. If you choose to stay on land while he's underwater, it is entirely possible for him to turn into the old Plesioth and take pot shots at you. Green Plesioth is back, and G-Rank exclusive. His biggest difference is that unlike the standard Plesioth, he can sweep his beam while underwater. It is worth mentioning that Plesioth can be fished out using a frog in pretty much any game he is in, which forces him to fight on land for a while. Moving on to the 4th generation, underwater combat was removed from the series entirely, and initially, not a single piscine wyvern was present. Actually, scratch that, not a single piscine wyvern was fightable. Plesioth could be found in the village of Chico Sands, particularly in Sunsnag Isle, which is populated by felines. In this village is a contraption that can be used to catch fish, and this occasionally includes Plesioth or his subspecies, who can be found swimming around there. Successful timing will result in the easiest Plesioth kill of all time, allowing you to make some of his gear. Failing to catch him will have him rise up to sweep a beam of water. While Plesioth continued to wage war with the felines, Cephadrome returned in full ultimate. In this game, he appears to be browner in colour to further distinguish him from Cephalos, who also returned. Cephadrome retains his old attacks from Freedom Unite, and in this game he can perform a leaping attack across the sand that paralyzes you. Overall, he's not much different to how he used to be, but his old attacks have been reanimated to be more fluid. Moving on to Generations, Cephadrome is present and identical to his full ultimate self. Plesioth has returned, without underwater this time, and therefore more in line with his Freedom Unite self. In terms of moveset, his bite can also cause sleep and will home in on you. Many other new additions emerge when he's enraged, which includes a stronger hip check that has a bigger wind up and causes wind pressure. When he performs his standard water beam, he will shake his head near the end of the attack, sending the beam in different directions. Lavasioth also returned for Generations. In this game, he moves noticeably faster than in Freedom Unite. He can perform a backwards jump that lets him combo into a shimmy. However, he can often fake out and simply stand up again instead. Lavasioth has a new attack sequence where he will dig into the ground and perform a series of attacks where he dives upwards and launches molten chunks of rock on his way down, which split into other rocks. Sometimes he will dive upwards and spit a rock directly at you. At least once during this sequence, he will surface and look side to side, which is an opportunity to strike. What's interesting is that before Lavasioth digs, he spits into the ground first as if to melt it, allowing him to swim through. At the end of the attack sequence, he resurfaces and shimmies across the ground. In G rank, he can fire 3 molten chunks of rock in a row while walking backwards, and can shimmy around in more directions faster, a bit like how he was in Freedom Unite. Now we move on to the 5th generation, which does not have Plesioth or Cephadrome. World introduces a new piscine wyvern encountered early in the game located in the Wildspire waste, the Jyuratodus, who heavily resembles a Lavasioth but is massively shrunken down. Jyuratodus swims around in shallow water and makes use of mud, covering himself in it for protection or firing it at hunters. He can also leave it on the ground, where they solidify as platforms for hunters to walk above the water, which normally slows them down unless they have a special skill. They can also drop as mud globs, which severely slows a hunter down. When submerged, Jyuratodus can zoom at hunters, fire up to 3 projectiles, or dive below the water and leap up for a big attack. He can also sweep his tail from side to side and bite at you. Dealing enough damage will knock him out of the water, causing him to walk around like a normal piscine wyvern. He also tends to attack like a standard piscine wyvern, firing mud projectiles, shimmying, are all things he does until he decides to dive back into the water. Jyuratodus will sometimes go below the water to cover himself in mud, which can reduce damage dealt against him. It can either be washed off with attacks or water pods. Encountered later in the game's high rank is Lavasioth, who is back. In this game, he's been massively redesigned to be much smaller, about the same size as Jyuratodus. In the older games he would never roar, but in World he does. He shoots lava from his mouth as a liquid, and he leaves lava on the ground whenever he shimmies around. Lavasioth has a new mechanic in the form of armor. When he swims in lava, his body heats up and softens, allowing you to damage him. But over time it cools down and hardens, which causes your weapons to bounce off. This is similar to Agnacta's magma armor in the 3rd generation, but unlike Agnacta, Lavasioth's armor cannot be permanently disabled. However, firing torch pods can reheat various parts of it, and tenderizing him with a clutch claw will negate his armor entirely. He gains more new attacks when enraged. In Area 10 of the Elder's Recess, Lavasioth will dig down and emerge from the holes in the ground, spewing lots of lava drops everywhere. He can also dive from pool to pool, before eventually landing on the ground. Lavasioth can also charge up an explosive lava blast that he fires on the ground. In other areas of the recess, he can swim like Jyuratodus, sharing many attacks with him. Like Jyuratodus, dealing enough damage to Lavasioth will knock him out and have him walk around on land. He also has a variation of his Gen ultimate dive and jump attacks. Here he will submerge himself, emerge with a bite attack or lava blast, and then dive back down again, doing this a couple of times before emerging with a jump attack. All of this spreads lava on the ground, which damages you over time. Iceborne introduces a new piscine wyvern, the Beotodus, who resides in the Hoarfrost Reach. He looks quite different to the others, having a large horn and fin. Rather than water or lava, Beotodus swims around in the snow. Like the water with Jyuratodus, the snow can slow you down, adding to the overall difficulty. Beotodus is the first monster to be encountered in Master Rank. Unlike the other two Piscine wyverns, he can roar and is generally much faster than them. He can spin around while swimming, smack his horn into the ground, and he can backflip into the snow, before leaping across the area with a snowy explosion. Some of his attacks have him rapidly swim towards you, and in general, he's far better at moving through his terrain than the other Piscine wyverns were. When on his feet, Beotodus fights similarly to Plesioth, hip checking, swinging his tail and biting. He shares some attacks with Jyuratodus, although he performs them faster. Before we move on, it's worth mentioning that Iceborne's endgame map, the Guiding Lands, cannot host Jyuratodus or Beotodus, because there are no regions with the deep water or snow. However, Lavasioth can be fought there. Moving on to Monster Hunter Rise and Sunbreak, only one Piscine wyvern returned, Jyuratodus. In this game, he is encountered later than you would expect, being the urgent quest to reach Hunter rank 5, and not in low rank at all. Rise doesn't have world's water or snow mechanics that slow you down, so in this game, Jyuratodus has been massively upgraded. His roar now actually stuns you, and it's harder to make him flinch. He has a new combo where he spits a projectile and runs to the side, which he repeats twice. He no longer leaves the hardened mud on the ground, instead it will just slow you down, although not as severely as it would in World. When submerged, he can hip check and perform an attack where he spreads mud across the ground in a V shape before either hip checking or charging at you. If he leaps into the air while enraged, mud globs will scatter across the area, similar to what Lavasioth used to do. He also shoots even more globs when enraged, up to 3 at once. The Piscine wyverns have had a very interesting journey, starting with Plesioth and Cephadrome before ending so far with Jyuratodus. I really like old Plesioth. All the monster fights tend to be quite simple, where they have a few threatening attacks, but there's a specific strategy needed to beat them, and this is very much true with Plesioth. People for a very long time have criticised and made fun of Plesioth for the giant hitboxes of his hip check and tail spins, but those aspects are very intentional in order to keep you away from his legs. The real strategy to kill this version of Plesioth is to stand a bit in front of him to bait out his laser and then strike his head until he dies, keeping away so as not to be hit by his physical attacks, and this makes for a really fun fight. It was really cool how 3 Ultimate let us fight him underwater, and it's quite funny that his attacks are far more telegraphed under there than on land. However, the removal of underwater combat made it so he was just reverted to his Freedom Unite self for Generations, which I kind of prefer. He is a pretty good fight in my opinion. On the other hand, I've never liked Cephadrome. I think he looks ugly and has always been a bit of a pain to fight, and not in a good way like Plesioth. Generally, I don't like monsters that spend a lot of time hiding, and his body is so thin that it's really easy to mess up attacks. That being said, I really enjoy fighting Lavasioth. Back in the day, I actually used to dislike Plesioth, which made this guy here a massive surprise because of how fun his fight was. He has more moveset variety, it's easier to hit him thanks to his larger body mass, and I find him strangely adorable too. The way he peeks out of the ground and looks left and right stands out to me in particular. I don't like what they did to him in World though. They completely shrunk him down and removed quite a bit of the personality of the original. When the original became enraged, he would stop and rapidly look left and right, but the World version just roars. While the armour is something nice to use your slinger on, it doesn't really impact the fight in the same way Agnacta's armour did. His smaller size again makes him so much less imposing too. I partly wonder if Lavasioth in World was a late addition, because visually he's almost identical to Jyuratodus. We know they only added Uragan because Radaban was finished, and they realised a lot of the work could be reused, and I wonder if the same thing happened here. Speaking of Jyuratodus, he's very weirdly handled in World, only being able to move in 3 areas in one map in the entire game, and because he's a starter monster, you won't ever really encounter him again naturally. He was quite pathetic in World, which made Rise's inclusion funnier as it tried to buff him by quite a bit. They definitely turned him into more than cannon fodder, but I still think he suffers from not having anything harder to directly contrast with. If Plesioth was also in Rise, Jyuratodus' inclusion would have made more sense. I really hope that if they ever bring back Plesioth, they don't reduce his size in the same way. Then there's Beotodus, who I fought for this video for the first time since I first played Iceborne. Initially, I wrote him off as a Jyuratodus clone, but upon refighting him I was quite surprised by how good he is. He has lots of unique attacks, and simply being faster made him much more threatening, especially with his fins above the snow like a shark. I really hope they can bring him back someday. He is a really solid fight. Which Piscine Wyvern is your favourite? What do you think of Lavasioth's changes? Let me know in the comments. Remember to like and subscribe, and have a good day.